Hey everybody, welcome to the Mana Leek. I'm John as always, and it's Monday, and that means that it is time for the Red Eldritch Moon Limited Set Review. One quick disclaimer, there's a couple more, but you should go back and check out the videos from the start to get those. The quick disclaimer here is that this is a limited set review. I will be discussing these cards from a draft and sealed perspective. If my grade is low and you think this is an amazing card in Legacy, doesn't matter. That's not what this review is for. But we're going to jump right on into the first card. Up first, we have Abandon Reason. Abandon Reason is 2 and a red for an instant at uncommon. Up to 2 target creatures each get +1/+0 and gain first strike until end of turn. And you can madness this out for 1 and a red to get yourself a 1 mana discount. This seems like an okay combat trick in an aggressive deck. It's no sure strike, but it does hopefully make 2 creatures live and kill their blockers or blockies. Seems like a fine combat trick, but not really one to go out of your way for. Madness is cool, but it's not worth much of an upgrade in the rating just because you can get a 1 mana discount. Seems like a fine combat trick. I probably will play this and not play it about equal amounts of time, so that's kind of the definition of a C. Up next, we have Alchemist's Greeting. Alchemist's Greeting is 4 and a red for a sorcery at common. Alchemist's Greeting deals 4 damage to target creature. Madness for 1 and a red. The full cost for this is horrible. Absolutely horrible. It's literally reduced to ashes, except it does 1 less damage. But it costs the same. That is bad, and reduced to ashes was already pretty mediocre. The Madness, though, is how you basically always want to cast this, because the Madness is really nice. 1 and a red for 4 damage at sorcery speed to a creature. That's pretty darn solid. So if you don't have many ways of enabling Madness, this needs to be put on your chopping block during deck construction. It's probably playable in sealed, but outside of that, you're probably going to want to cut this if you don't have many Madness enablers. If you do have the Madness enablers, this gets a lot better. So this really is kind of deck dependent. Let's go with a C+ on it, with the caveat that you really need to be ready to not play this if you don't have ways of madnessing it out. Up next, we have Assembled Alphas. Assembled Alphas is 5 and a red for a creature wolf at rare. It's a 5/5. Whenever Assembled Alphas blocks or becomes blocked by a creature, Assembled Alphas deals 3 damage to that creature and 3 damage to that creature's controller. 6 is a little bit pricey, but a 5/5 that hits like an 8/8 is pretty decent, plus an extra 3 damage to your opponent, so it kind of hits like an 11/11 trample, kind of. Yeah, this is just really, really good. It'll shut down a lot of games really quickly unless your opponent has an immediate answer, which means that this is in bomb territory. I think this is likely first pickable, and it will be the star of a slightly later stompy kind of red deck. Obviously, if you are the red deck that is going 2-drop, 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 3-drop, 3-drop, you probably don't want to play this, but in anything else, red-green especially, I think this would be pretty solid. I think because this probably doesn't make the cut in aggro decks, it only makes the cut in mid-range and later game decks, we can't quite give it, a massive A or A+, but it can definitely get an A-. Yeah, pretty solid card. Pretty happy to first pick it. A-. Up next, we have Bedlam Reveler. Bedlam Reveler is 6 red for a creature devil horror at rare. It's a 3/4. Bedlam Reveler costs 1 less mana to cast for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. It has prowess, and when Bedlam Reveler enters the battlefield, discard your hand, then draw 3 cards. Not 100% sold on this. Obviously, it's meant to be at home in the blue-red spells deck, and I'm going to talk about that deck a lot today. I don't think any other deck really wants to touch this. You'll reliably get maybe a 2 mana discount in your average deck, which isn't really worth it. This becomes a 4 red 3/4 prowess that gives you sort of an ancestral recall after you discard your hand. That isn't super worth it for me in the average deck. Remember, you're likely to be pumping a pretty serious amount of mana into casting this, so it's unlikely that you're going to get to madness any of those cards that you're discarding away, so don't think of that as being that big of an upside. I don't know. I'm not sold on this in your average deck. I am sold on it in the blue-red spells deck, and I think the blue-red spells deck is going to be actually easier to build in this format, because as you'll see, a lot of the payoffs are at uncommon and at common. There are some awesome rare ones, but there's more than just that one single Rise from the Tides. So I think that deck is definitely possible, and I think first picking this is reasonable to go into that deck. But I don't think this is all that reasonable in any other deck. So I am going to give this a B. I think it is fine in that one deck. Outside of that deck, I think you probably want to think about cutting it and not picking it. So I'm going to go with a B on Bedlam Reveler. Up next, we have Blood Mist. Blood Mist is 3 and a red for an enchantment at uncommon. It says at the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature you control gains double strike until end of turn. This is very similar to Nahiri's Machinations, and I think it's going to be exactly like Nahiri's Machinations in people saying it is amazing and other people saying it is terrible, and I'm in the terrible camp. I think Machinations is better than this, and I barely played Machinations. I don't think Machinations was good. I think it was fine if you had to, but I don't think it was good. This is 4 mana. It takes up a card slot. It's only good when you're in the lead and have a creature of any real size and can attack with it, in which case you should be winning anyways. So why not play another creature? Why not play another spell that's going to keep that creature alive or kill another creature? Why not play something better than this? This is pure win more. I don't think you should ever play this card, pick this card, ever use this card. I will be beaten by it, but it doesn't mean it was right to play it. So I've got to go with a D on this one. Next up, we have Bold Impaler. Bold Impaler is a single red mana for a creature vampire knight at common. It's a 1/2, and you can pay 2 and a red to give Bold Impaler +2/+0 until end of turn. So this is an Ember Eye Wolf that costs 1 less to cast, but it costs 1 more to activate. It loses haste, and it gains a relevant creature type, although Ember Eye Wolf had a relevant creature type as well. That's just not okay to me. This feels like a very 24th card. This is a card that there should be basically a bunch of other things that you probably don't want to play but will play before you play this in your pool, be it sealed or in draft. This just is so unimpactful as a 1-drop and doesn't do anything without pumping ridiculous amounts of mana into it. In fact, this is exactly Lava Step Raider from Battle for Zendikar, which was horrible there as well. This gains a slightly more relevant creature type than Lava Step Raider did, but it's not enough. You should never be playing this card. It should be sitting in your sideboard and never really come out of it. So I'm going to go with a D- on it. Do not like Bold Impaler. Next up, we have Borrowed Hostility. Borrowed Hostility is a single red mana for an instant at common. It has Escalate 3. Choose one or both. Target creature gets +3/+0 until end of turn. Target creature gains first strike until end of turn. Well, this is twice as expensive as Sure Strike if you want to staple it together, which isn't really great. But if you just want 1/2, red is an okay cost to pay. Still, this really seems to fall into that sort of, hey, have space for a combat trick and want one? Well, here you go. Oh, you don't? Well, that's cool. I'll just hang out in the sideboard. Kind of zone. Yeah. If you need a trick, here you go. If you don't need it. It's kind of a definition of like a C. Cut it, don't cut it. It's all fine by me. Next up, we have Brazen Wolves. Brazen Wolves is 2 and a red for a creature wolf at common. It's a 2/3, and it says whenever Brazen Wolves attacks, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So it's a 2/3 for 3, which isn't terribly good, but it attacks as a 4/3. That's all right. As long as you're fairly aggressive, this is a pretty decent beater. Outside of that, it's not nearly as good. You need to be confident that you are going to beat down to play this and have it be solid. But even when it's not, it's still just filler. So I am willing to go with a C+ on it. You'll probably just always play the first one of these that you'll have. You'll never go out of your way in draft to pick it up, but that first one, it's going to get in your deck almost always. C+. Up next, we have Collective Defiance. Collective Defiance is 1 red for a sorcery at rare. It says, Escalate 1. Choose 1 or more. Target player discards all cards in his or her hand, then draws that many cards. Collective Defiance deals 4 damage to target creature. Collective Defiance deals 3 damage to target opponent. Sorcery Speed Burn isn't the best, but it's still totally playable and pickable. So the default here is probably 1 red for 4 damage to a creature, which is fine. It'll kill an awful lot of things in the format. Basically everything that exists for 3 mana, and most things that exist for 4 mana. If you can afford the extra mana, bolting your opponent as well is great. Why not turn it into, 4 damage to a creature and 3 damage for a single extra mana for 2 red? That seems perfectly fine. In fact, it's 1 extra damage to your opponent than Chandra's Outrage for the same mana cost. Chandra's Outrage, however, was instant back in the day from M14. 14, I want to say that was. Yeah, it seems totally fine. As well, if you have the extra mana and you have just a bunch of lands in hand or something, you can discard your hand and draw some lands back. That's going to be cool. There's going to be a number of times where that's not relevant. You're going to have better stuff in your hand that you don't just want to throw away, or you're going to be empty-handed. So that's not a big deal, but still, this is pretty darn solid and pretty first pickable as removal, barring a bomb flip card or foil or something like that in the pack. So I'm willing to go with a pretty darn solid B+ on this. Next up, we have Conduit of Storms. Conduit of Storms is 2 and a red for a creature werewolf horror at uncommon. It's a 2/3. Whenever Conduit of Storms attacks, add red to your mana pool at the beginning of your next main phase this turn. And the werewolves in Eldritch Moon don't flip the same way. They flip as though they had monstrous. So you pay 3 red to transform Conduit of Storms. Conduit of Storms becomes Conduit of Emrakul. Conduit of Emrakul is a creature Eldrazi werewolf at uncommon. It's a 5/4, and whenever Conduit of Emrakul attacks, add colorless to your mana pool at the beginning of your next main phase this turn. So on the front side, this is an okay creature. Again, it's a 2/3 for 3, which is pretty filler, but when it attacks, it helps ramp you up in your second main phase, and that's alright, and probably enough for a C+ right there. The flip side is bigger. It has and it's an alright way to spend 5 mana if you can spare it. It's really nice at instant speed, end of your opponent's turn. You can hold up burn or something like that, and if you don't have to use it, may as well flip your werewolf, and it becomes a 5/4. The colorless boost isn't really that amazing. At this point in the game, we're heading towards the late game, and the extra mana really shouldn't be that big of a deal. Plus, if you're able to swing in with a 5/4 without fear, you're probably just going to be winning anyways. That colorless is just win more at that point. If I'm tapping a 5/4 with no fear of my opponent doing anything, shouldn't really be a big deal, just finishing the game off. So I am going to keep this as a C+. So C+ for Conduit of Storms / Conduit of Emrakul. Next up, we have Deranged Whelp. Deranged Whelp is 1 and a red for a creature wolf at uncommon. It's a 2/1 and it has Menace. Whelp seems fine. It's not exactly a bear, but Menace makes it fine enough that it will attack in without too much trouble in the early game. It's not a great card, but it's a fine enough to include in your typical aggro deck. I think you'll basically always play it, and I think you'll pick it, not exactly highly, but you'll pick it like middle of the mid pack, and probably just always include it in basically every red deck. 2/1 Menace for 2? Seems fine. C+. Next up, we have Distemper of the Blood. Distemper of the Blood is 1 and a red for a sorcery at common. Target creature gets +2/+2 and gains trample until end of turn. Madness for a single red mana. This is probably just worse than Rush of Adrenaline, since it won't always be a single red mana. Even though that does give an extra toughness boost over what Rush of Adrenaline did, one of the big benefits of Rush of Adrenaline is just always being a single red mana. So I'm going to drop it from the typical C combat trick rating that is kind of like included or don't include it to a C-, because 1 and a red is a little bit costly for this effect. If you can always Madness it, sure, it'll be a C, but I don't think you can guarantee that, so C-. Next up, we have Falcon Wrath Reaver. Falcon Wrath Reaver is 1 and a red for a creature vampire at common. It's a 2/2, and that's it. It is literally just a bear. Not something that red gets all that often. Bears are typically the domain of white and green cards. Red usually gets 2/1s, or they get 2/2s that deal damage to you, or things like that. A straight up 2/2 for 2 with a relevant creature type. This is purely solid. You're always going to play this. It's always going to be totally fine. C, solid C. Up next, we have Fury Blade Vampire. Fury Blade Vampire is 1 and a red for a creature vampire berserker at uncommon. It's a 1/2, it's got trample, and it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, you may discard a card. If you do, Fury Blade Vampire gets +3/+0 until end of turn. A 1/2 for 2 is not exactly the best, and not something you want to be playing. This is a decent enough Madness enabler in that it's free, and it turns the vampire into a 4/2, which is a good attacker if your opponent has no blockers, but otherwise it's pretty mediocre and dies to almost everything. Thankfully, it is just a 2-drop. It's not like this is a 4-mana 4/2 or anything. The trample does help out a little bit, but not enough to raise this above a C for me. I think you probably should cut this a number of times. If you're in the vampire deck, totally fine. If you're in the Madness deck, totally fine. If you're being super aggressive, totally fine. Outside of those situations, you should probably cut it. So it feels like kind of a 50-50 thing to me, but more of a deck-dependent thing than a pool-dependent thing. So Solid C. Next up, we have Galvanic Bombardment. Galvanic Bombardment is a single red mana for an instant at common. Galvanic Bombardment deals X damage to target creature, where X is 2 plus the number of cards named Galvanic Bombardment in your graveyard. This seems pretty darn solid to me. Unlike Take Inventory, which I didn't terribly like, I really like Galvanic Bombardment. This card's Shock for the first copy. The first copy is Shock, which is always playable and decently highly pickable. Not hitting players is a little bit of a big deal, but not enough to hurt this card too much. If you get the 2 of these, then the second copy is Lightning Bolt, which is fantastic and first pickable, absolutely. And it just goes up from there. If you get 3 of these, a single red mana for 4 damage to a creature, that is just huge, and at instant speed too. I would gladly play the first one of these, the second one of these, the third one of these, the fourth one of these in every red deck. Just super solid. Probably first pickable in weaker decks where there's not unconditional removal or a bomb. Yeah, I'll play as many copies of these as I can. Solid B. Next up, we have Hanweir Garrison. Hanweir Garrison is 2 and a red for a creature human soldier at rare. It's a 2/3. Whenever Hanweir Garrison attacks, put 2 1/1 red human creature tokens onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. And it melds with Hanweir Battlement, which we'll talk about on Wednesday. That's a land. And we'll talk about the meld side on Wednesday as well, once we get past the second part. So, this is a 2/3 that attacks with 2 1/1 red humans, so it kind of attacks as a 4/5. Sort of. That is pretty darn solid. It's very similar to the creature from Scar's block that I can't remember the name of, but you'll all remind me about it in the comments below. Yeah, those 1/1s might get chump blocked, but it's still some serious pressure that can be applied, and if they don't, you have them. They stick around. They don't get exiled or anything. I think Hanweir Garrison is probably totally first pickable. It's not quite bomb status. It is not answer this or the game is over next turn or 2 turns from now, but it is going to put some serious pressure on your opponent. I don't think you should ever take this assuming that you're going to meld it, because the land that you need is a rare as well. But I think this card is just 100% playable and first pickable on its own, just barely below bomb status, so I'm going to go with a B+ on it. Next up, we have Harmless Offering. Harmless Offering is 2 and a red for a sorcery at rare. It says target opponent gains control of target permanent you control. Yes, this card is adorable. I agree, it's fantastic. But this is one of the Call of the Gatewatch cards from this set, because of course we have Deploy the Gatewatch and some other things. This is the rare that I'm going to open a bajillion copies of and is not going to be playable in any way, shape, or form. There's nothing worth trying to finagle this in Limited. Don't bother. Don't take this card. Don't play this card. It is horrible. F-, right up there with Deploy the Gatewatch. If I get a pack that has a Harmless Offering and a foil Deploy the Gatewatch, I will quit Magic forever. Forever. F-. Next up, we have Impetuous Devils. Impetuous Devils is 2 red for a creature devil at rare. It's a 6/1. It has trample and haste, and at the beginning of the end step, sacrifice Impetuous Devils. That sounds really familiar. That sounds like Ball Lightning. But wait, there's more. When Impetuous Devils attacks, up to 1 target creature defending player controls blocks this combat if able. So this is Ball Lightning that is easier to cast, although it does cost 1 extra mana. Ball Lightning is this card minus that middle block of text, and Ball Lightning costs red. This costs 2 and a red, easier to cast despite being a little bit more expensive. And I get to choose which of my opponent's creatures is going to be run over. I'm in. I like all in. I like this. This seems first pickable to me as it's functionally removal. It can be countered in a few additional ways that removal can't. Dual Shot could counter this quote-unquote removal spell. But it's Ball Lightning 2.0. Come on. Fantastic. Love it. I will first pick this card. It's not bomb status. It is sort of, like good removal status, which means I'm not going to put it into A, but I am going to go solid B+. Next up, we have Incendiary Flow. Incendiary Flow is 1 and a red for a sorcery at uncommon. Incendiary Flow deals 3 damage to target creature or player. If a creature dealt damage this way would die this turn, exile it instead. Another pretty solid sorcery speed burn card. This one can hit a player or creature, which is great, and it's 1 and a red, which is great. It's really just the sorcery speed that's holding this back, and it's barely even doing that. Seems first pickable, seems always playable. I would be totally happy to play with this. This is basically a Pillar of Flame, I think it was, from original Innistrad block. I think it was Avacyn Restored, possibly. Solid card, 1 extra damage than that card, 1 extra mana than that card. Seems fine, seems first pickable. Solid burn, B. Solid B. Insatiable Gorgers is up next. Insatiable Gorgers is a 2 red creature vampire berserker at uncommon 5/3. Insatiable Gorgers attacks each combat if able. Madness for 3 and a red. This is a 5/3 for 4. Whether or not you play it for Madness, it's just for Madness, it's slightly easier to cost with only a single red mana rather than 2. That must attack and trade down with many 3-drops. I don't really like that. This doesn't have trample, this doesn't have any form of evasion. It feels very filler level to me. I have no idea why it's an uncommon. This really feels like a common to me, and it doesn't feel good. Instant speed, you could Madness and block with this, I guess, but this is a far cry from Incorrigible Youths, which were so much better than this card, which feels similar but significantly worse. I'm going to go with a C-. I think I'm going to cut this very reliably and not really play it. 5/3s are just not my thing, so C-. Next up, we have Make Mischief. Make Mischief is 2 and a red for a sorcery at common. Make Mischief deals 1 damage to target creature or player. Put a 1/1 red devil creature token onto the battlefield. It has, when this creature dies, it deals 1 damage to target creature or player. 3 mana for a 1/1 devil that pings when it comes in and pings when it leaves is basically what this is, because it is a sorcery spell. I don't think I would pay 3 mana for a 1/1 that pings, and then when it dies, it pings again. That's way too pricey for me for way too low of an impact. If this was instant speed, this would be great. You could flash it in, ping, block, deal a damage, die, ping it again. It basically would be a 3 mana lightning bolt that only works in combat, and that would be okay. But at sorcery speed, I'm totally out on this. I think this card is just rather unplayable. I wouldn't even put this at 23rd. This is more 24th-ish card. I'll go with D+. If you really are desperate for playables, maybe, but I don't think you should play this very often at all. Next up, we have Mirror-Wing Dragon. Mirror-Wing Dragon is 3 red for a creature dragon at Mythic. It's a 4/5, it has flying of course, and whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell that targets only Mirror-Wing Dragon, that player copies that spell for each other creature he or she controls that the spell could target. Each copy targets a different one of those creatures. This is an amazing bomb Mythic. It's a 4/5 flyer for 5, I'm already sold. I'm already in. Especially in red, which just doesn't get that. Add into that the Zada ability, which was underwhelming in Battle for Zendikar, and probably will not be the most amazing use of Mirror-Wing Dragon, but if you do have a combat trick or something like that, hey, you get to use it, and that's pretty cool. Even better if you can put some counters on it or something and give everything on your team counters. But it's any player, so if your opponent casts Murder on your Mirror-Wing Dragon, they have to cast Murder on every creature they control. They wipe their board to kill Mirror-Wing Dragon. Mirror-Wing Dragon just has so much defense built into an amazing body with flying. I can't imagine this isn't just an absolute windmill slam. I have to go with an A+ on this. I think this is a massive bomb that your opponent has to have an answer to, and that answer is gonna hurt them. It's gonna hurt them bad. Yeah, Mirror-Wing Dragon, absolutely love it. A+. Next up, we have Nahiri's Wrath. Nahiri's Wrath is 2 and a red for a sorcery at Mythic as well. As an additional cost to cast Nahiri's Wrath, discard X cards. Nahiri's Wrath deals damage equal to the total converted mana cost of the discarded cards to each of up to X target creatures and or planeswalkers. There's 2 problems with this card. 1, it's sorcery speed. 2, it doesn't hit players. But neither of those matter. The CMC on this is really cheap that you can probably cast a Madness card or 2 off of it if you're discarding. It could function as a board wipe if you're desperate and discard your hand. And it scales so quickly. Discarding your first card, if it's a 2 or 3 drop, you're getting basically a lightning bolt. If you discard a 1 drop on top of that, suddenly you're dealing 4 damage to 2 different creatures or planeswalkers. Very solid. Can't hit players. If it could, it would be broken because on turn 3 you could probably discard your hand and, almost kill your opponent, and that is not a card that should ever exist. But yeah, this just seems super powerful, super first pickable, solid A. It can be a dead card if it's the only card in your hand, but solid A. Next up is Otherworldly Outburst. Otherworldly Outburst is a single red mana for an instant at common. Target creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. When that creature dies this turn, put a 3/2 colorless Eldrazi horror creature token onto the battlefield. I'm going to have to play with this to know for sure, but I don't think I like it. +1/+0 is in no way worth a card as a combat trick or for any reason, really. Getting a 3/2 out of a creature that's going to die anyways is fine, but it's also so reactive that I don't know that I want to spend a card in my deck on doing that. Like, this card does literally nothing if you're ahead, if you're able to attack in. It's such a reactive card that I'm going to start out on it at a C-. Just does not feel like what I want to be doing in Limited ever, so C-. Next up, we have Prophetic Ravings. Prophetic Ravings is a single red mana for an enchantment aura at common. Enchant creature. Enchanted creature has haste and tap. Discard a card. Draw a card. So it's an aura that gives haste, and that's never worth a card. I will never play single red mana, give a creature haste. Mad Prophet is a great card, and it's not just a good card for enabling madness. And I saw that as common confusion. A lot of people would often comment saying, why are you running Mad Prophet? You don't have any madness cards. Mad Prophet is just a good card. It existed in Avacyn Restored, where there was no discard real reasons, and it was still really good. It's a good card. It doesn't have to have madness. But spending a card to build a Mad Prophet and setting yourself up for a 2-for-1, totally out. This card just seems garbage. Don't play it. D. Keep it in the sideboard, but still don't play it on the sideboard. Solid D. Next up, we have Savage Alliance. Savage Alliance is 2 and a red for an instant at uncommon. Escalate 1. Choose 1 or more. Creatures target player controls gain trample until end of turn. Savage Alliance deals 2 damage to target creature. Savage Alliance deals 1 damage to each creature target opponent controls. Geist Blast was totally playable as a burn spell, and this is the same thing. It can't hit players, but it is instant speed. That's 100% playable if you play this as 2 in a red, 2 damage to a creature. 100% playable. The fact that you can escalate this and turn this into a 4-mana lightning bolt to 1 creature, plus 1 damage to all the other creatures on that side of the table, really messes up combat math. In rare situations, you can pay an extra mana and get some trample through. Seems like a very solid combat trick, burn spell. I'll always play this. I'll pick it relatively highly. Probably never first pick. It would have to be a very weak pack to be first pick, but still pretty darn high. We've got to go with a B. Next up, we have Shreds of Sanity. Shreds of Sanity is 2 and a red for a sorcery at uncommon. Return up to 1 target instant card and up to 1 target sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand, then discard a card. Exile Shreds of Sanity. Like with Dutiful Return and such and Macabre Waltz, I don't think that you should ever think of this as a second copy of your awesome removal spell. Yeah, sometimes it'll function like that, and just as often it won't, because you will not have drawn your awesome removal spell, you will not have cast it yet, etc. In the blue-red spells deck, I think this could keep you going while being a spell itself, so it probably is somewhat playable in the blue-red all spells or mostly spells deck, which I think is going to be, as I said before, much easier to build in this set, and I'm really going to go for it. I'm really going to try it. I think it could be decently solid. There's a lot of burn. There's a lot of payoffs for it at common and uncommon and rare. Seems awesome. Outside of that deck, you should never be touching this card ever. So it's going to get a D+. In that one deck, could be playable. I still don't think it will be, but it could be. But outside of that deck, D+, don't play it. Up next, we have Smoldering Werewolf. Smoldering Werewolf is 2 red for a creature werewolf horror. At uncommon, it's a 3/2. When Smoldering Werewolf enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to each of up to 2 target creatures. Pay 4 red, transform Smoldering Werewolf. It transforms into Erupting Dreadwolf. Creature Eldrazi Werewolf, it's a 6/4. When Erupting Dreadwolf attacks, it deals 2 damage to target creature or player. So 2 red is a little bit pricey for a 3/2, but you do get a free dual shot attached to it, which isn't worse than I guess technically you are just paying for that dual shot. It's playable, but unexciting on that front side. If it does live to you having 6 mana, which shouldn't be too big of a deal, that's just 2 turns later, then you get to flip it over and it becomes a 6/4 that casts Shock every time it attacks. Very, very solid. I think this is a pretty solid card that probably every deck will be happy, or every red deck will be happy to play. I don't know exactly how high I'd pick it though. Probably not first pick ever, Probably within the first few picks, though. I'm thinking probably like pick 3, pick 4 is where I think I'd start to take this and be pretty happy about it. The monster's likability is very nice, as you can kind of pass the turn with some tricks or removal up, and then if it doesn't come up, then you can just pop it into this, and you get yourself a fantastic creature. I like this guy a fair bit. I think he's a B-. I think he's not exactly a first pick, but he's always includable, and you're going to be relatively happy about including him, so B-. Next up is Spreading Flames. Spreading Flames is 6 and a red for an instant at uncommon. Spreading Flames deals 6 damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures. 7 mana. This is basically what everybody hoped an awesome Avacyn's Judgment would be, where you discard it and cast it for red and 6 and do a whole bunch of damage to a bunch of different things. But here you have to do that. You don't get to make this into a shock or into a lightning bolt or into 3 damage or whatever. You have to pay 7 to get 6 damage out of it. It's instant speed, which is pretty solid. It doesn't hit face. That seems like a serious step down. I feel like this is basically an auto-include in sealed, but the real question is draft. Probably like a B- for sealed. You'll always include it. Sealed, you'll probably get to 7 mana. It's not too unlikely for games to go long in sealed. In draft, you need to know that you are going to get to 7. So we're talking a mid-rangey, late-game kind of deck. If you're there, then you could play this, but otherwise you probably don't want to. This will be a card that I'm going to keep an eye on because it's really format speed dependent. And I have no idea where you're supposed to pick this. I have no idea if you take this and say, all right, we're going to go late game. If you pass this until you know you're going to go late game and then pick it up, I really don't know. I'm going to start with a C+ on it, but remember, as I said, this is basically an auto-include in sealed decks. Up next is Stensia Banquet. Stensia Banquet is 2 and a red for a sorcery at common. Stensia Banquet deals damage to target opponent equal to the number of vampires you control. Draw a card. Not much to say about this one, really. If you're in a pretty sizable vampire deck, then maybe you could play this. I still wouldn't play it, I don't think. Damage to the face, like purely to the face with no other options, usually isn't great unless it's doing something else. This is drawing a card, which is nice, but it still is not very good. In the very vampire-y deck, I think this is probably like a C, and in everything else, it's probably like a D-. I guess you could play it to thin out your deck, but sounds like a bad idea. So C- in the very vampire deck, unplayable elsewhere. Next up, we have Stensia Innkeeper. Stensia Innkeeper is 3 and a red for a 3/3 creature vampire at common. When Stensia Innkeeper enters the battlefield, tap target land an opponent controls. That land doesn't untap during its next controller's untap step. This feels possibly like R&D is trying to expand Red's color pie a little bit and turn it into this sort of land freeze ability. Red doesn't really get land destruction too much more these days because it's really crappy to play against. So maybe this is kind of what is going to replace land destruction for Red, but we'll see. Anyways, 3/3 for 4 is a little bit overcosted, but you do get the upside of taking your opponent off a land for a turn. Seems like a solid tempo play. It might actually be fine in an aggressive deck to keep your opponent on their back foot. It's not amazing, it's not a high pick, but probably always playable as a 23rd card, so I'm willing to give it just a solid middle-of-the-road C. Next up is Stromkirk Outcast. Stromkirk Outcast is 2 and a red for a creature vampire horror at rare. It's a 3/2, it has trample. Whenever Stromkirk Occultist deals combat damage to a player, exile the top card of your library. Until end of turn, you may play that card. You can Madness this out for 1 and a red to get a little bit of a discount. So it's a 3/2 for 3, which is normal and filler level. Giving it trample doesn't do too much, really. But it helps the ability go off because, of course, it can get through and then trigger. It's a fairly decent ability as well. You obviously don't want to be too loaded up with high cost spells that you might just lose by flipping them. But in a lowish curve deck, this should be a pretty decent card draw if you can get the damage through. As well, it does say play that card, meaning that if you do flip a land, you can play it, assuming you haven't already played a land that turn. So do not play your turns, or do not play your lands before combat. Play them after, once you flip the card off the Outcast. It's probably first pickable, although not over premium removal and not over a bomby card. You'll probably always play it as well. It sides into the not overly flashy, not going to win you the game, but going to give you a good deal of value over time kind of level of card. So I'm willing to go with a B+ on it. Next up, we have Thermo Alchemist. Thermo Alchemist is 1 and a red for a creature human shaman at common. It's an 0/3. It has Defender. Tap, Thermo Alchemist deals 1 damage to each opponent. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, untap Thermo Alchemist. This is yet another of the cards that really kind of pays off the blue-red spells deck, and it's at common. You don't have to worry about, am I ever going to see this? You probably will always see a Thermo Alchemist in every draft, and if you're the blue-red spells deck, it should be there for you. Outside of that deck, I don't think it's too good. You could maybe side it in out of the board if you find out that you really aren't the beatdown and you need an early blocker, but in that blue-red spells deck, it's going to be pinging every turn, possibly for 2. If you get a couple of these, you can really start a serious clock going. I'm going to dive head first into that blue-red spells deck this format, and I think this guy's going to help me out with that. So in the blue-red spells deck, I think this guy's like a C+. Outside of that, he's more like a D, a pure sideboard card. Next up, we have Villadin Pack Outcast. Villadin Pack Outcast is a 4 and a red creature werewolf horror at common. It's a 4/4. It has trample. You can pay a red to give it +1/-1 until end of turn, so it has the Flowstone ability from way back when. And you can pay 5 red to transform it into Drone Pack Kindred. Drone Pack Kindred is a creature Eldrazi werewolf. It is a 5/7. It has trample, and you can pay 1 generic mana to Fire Breathe it to give it +1/+0 until end of turn. So 5 mana for a 4/4 isn't super appealing to me. It's a little bit too big and dumb. It does have trample, and that Flowstone ability could be used quite well if you're ahead to get in some serious extra damage. It can kill bigger creatures than itself and still just get through damage. You could almost turn it into a giant ball lightning if you really wanted to, just by turning it into, what could you do? You could turn it into a 7/1 trample, which seems pretty darn good. Yeah, it's fine. It's going to cost you a lot of mana to actually get that to go off. If you do flip it, you get a 5/7 trample with fire breathing, which is nothing to scoff at. It's a pretty solid card, but overall, it's just kind of normally costed. Everything is costed really, really fairly. You're getting some good damage, you're getting trample, you're getting a good creature, but you are paying absolutely for every last inch of it. You're not overpaying, but you're definitely not underpaying. So, I don't know, it feels like 22nd cardish. I think you will play the first one. Maybe not an aggressive deck because you're going to want that mana for little things, and you're not necessarily going to have, more than 5 or 6 mana before you want the game over. But in many decks, I think it's always playable as kind of a 22nd card. So C+ from me. All right, we made it. We're at the final card for red. We have Weaver of Lightning. Weaver of Lightning is 2 and a red for a creature, human shaman at uncommon. It's a 1/4. It has reach. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, Weaver of Lightning deals 1 damage to target creature an opponent controls. Yet another blue-red spells matters card at uncommon this time. It is a decent complement to Thermo Alchemist in the blue-red spells deck. It's also another solid blocker. It's a 1/4 for 3. It has reach, so it can pick those pesky spirits and birds and such out of the air. And yeah, attacking a single damage to a creature on every single instant sorcery spell you cast is pretty solid. This is totally fine, I think, in every deck. I think every deck would be okay with this card. It's not the most aggressive card, but if you are anything but pure aggro, I think this card is playable and definitely sideboardable, like the Thermo Alchemist. And then in the blue-red spells deck, I think it's pretty darn solid. If you can cast a couple of spells and get a shock attached to them, it's a totally fine upside. So in the blue-red spells deck, I think this is kind of C+-ish, and in the other decks, I think it's kind of like C-ish. Weaver of Lightning, totally fine card. So that's going to wrap it up for red. Red looks powerful. There's a lot of burn, and there's a lot of solid creatures. There's a lot of Bs, a lot of As, a lot of C+. It looks like a really, really, really good color. As well, I talked a lot about that blue-red spells deck. There's one more card coming for that deck at least that we'll talk about on Wednesday. I think that deck is going to be a real thing, much more real than it was in Shadows over Innistrad, because you're not locked into getting basically that one card that you need for the deck to work, and if you don't get it, it's garbage. Here, you're going to get the cards that you need to make it work, and then if you're lucky, you might get the awesome ones, like Docent of Perfection. But I'm very excited to play red. I don't necessarily want to open it at the pre-release, because you can't probably do blue-red spells at the pre-release in sealed, but still just seems like a very powerful color. Let me know what your favorite cards are in this. Let me know which ratings you disagree with, which ones you agree with, etc. in the comments down below. There's been some great discussion down there so far. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, you can find me on Twitter at TheManaLeak, Facebook.com/TheManaLeak, and Twitch.tv/TheManaLeak. You found me here on YouTube. You've got that comment section down below. Click that thumbs up icon if you like the content. Click that subscribe button if you haven't already so that you can keep up to date on all the videos as they get posted. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you all tomorrow for green.